I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam a single door. I just stopped. And the silence I left behind said everything I'd been swallowing for 11 years. My name is not important. What matters is that I'm 63 years old. I spent the better part of a decade trying to do right by a family that was never fully mine, and on a Tuesday morning in October, I sat in the parking lot of a Marriott in Boise, Idaho, with a duffel bag in the back seat and a strange feeling in my chest that took me a while to recognize. It was peace. I hadn't felt it in a long time. I met my wife, Carol, at a church potluck in the fall of 2013. She was 51 then, recently divorced. Warm in the way that makes you feel like the room got brighter when she walked in. She had a daughter, 22 at the time, just finishing community college, named Stephanie. Carol mentioned her on our second date, said she was going through a rough patch, said she'd always been a bit sensitive, said she just needed time. I nodded. I understood rough patches. I'd had a few of my own. What I didn't understand, what I couldn't have known sitting across from Carol at that Italian place on Fairview Avenue, was that rough patch was a permanent condition for Stephanie. And that time would turn out to mean the next 11 years of my life. Carol and I married in 2015. Small ceremony, backyard. Her sister officiated. It was a good day. I remember thinking, this is the beginning of something real. Stephanie moved in 8 months later. She was 24. She'd had a job at a hotel front desk for about a year, but said the hours were getting to her. She needed to save money. Just for a few months, Carol said. Just until she got back on her feet. I said, okay, I want to be honest here, because I think honesty is the only reason any of this is worth telling. I didn't resent Stephanie at first. I genuinely tried. I cleared out the spare bedroom and put in a real bed frame, not just a mattress on the floor. I stocked the pantry with food she liked. I asked her about her plans, her interests, what kind of work she wanted to do. She gave short answers. One word, sometimes two. She wasn't hostile exactly. She was just absent. Present in the house, absent in every other sense. I told myself she was adjusting. The first time she said something that genuinely stung, it was about a year in. I'd come home from work. I was still consulting part-time for an engineering firm back then, and Carol had made dinner. The three of us were at the table. I made some comment about Stephanie, maybe looking into a certification program, something in healthcare administration, since she'd mentioned once that she liked working with people. She looked at me and said, very flatly, I didn't ask for your advice. Carol said her name softly. Stephanie shrugged and went back to her phone. I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth and said nothing. That was the first time. I want you to understand something. I am not a man who was blind to what was happening. I saw it. I saw it clearly, probably too clearly. But I also grew up watching my father leave when things got hard, and I made a quiet promise to myself somewhere in my 20s that I would not be that man. I would not cut and run. I would stay. I would work at it. I would do the hard thing. That promise, which I made out of something I thought was strength, turned out to be the thing Stephanie understood better than I did. She knew I would stay, so she never had to stop. Over the years, the list of things I paid for quietly and without comment is long enough to embarrass me now, not because of the money itself. I was doing well, the house was paid off, I had savings, but because of what the paying meant. It meant I was trying to purchase belonging. It meant I believed that if I just kept being useful, eventually she would see me as something more than an obstacle. I paid for 2 semesters of an online degree she never finished. I paid for a car, not new, but reliable, when she said she needed one for a job interview. I paid for that car's insurance for 3 years. I paid for a gym membership she used for 6 weeks. When she had a falling out with a boyfriend and needed first and last month's rent on an apartment, Carol asked me. I wrote the check. She moved back in 5 months later. I paid for the moving truck. Carol, to her credit, was not a bad person. I want to be careful about that. She loved Stephanie with the kind of love that doesn't know how to say no, and I think somewhere in her heart she knew the dynamic was off. There were nights she'd come to bed and I could feel the apology she wasn't saying. She'd reach for my hand in the dark and hold it, and I'd lie there thinking, just say it. Just say you see it too. She never did. And I never pushed. That's on both of us. Last year, in September, Carol's birthday was coming up. The whole family was supposed to come to the house. Her sister, her brother-in-law, a few cousins. Carol had been talking about it for weeks. She wanted it to feel special. I'd made a reservation at her favorite restaurant downtown for the night before, just the two of us, and ordered a cake from that bakery she loves on State Street. Stephanie had been living with us again for 8 months by then. She was 33 years old. 2 weeks before the birthday dinner, I noticed the joint account I'd added Carol to, and which, in a moment of generosity I'll always regret, I'd allowed Stephanie to have a card for emergencies, had been drawn down by just over $1,200. Charges at a nail salon, a clothing boutique, 2 Airbnb reservations in Portland, a restaurant I didn't recognize. I didn't say anything at dinner that night. But the next morning, I checked the account again. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with my coffee, and I thought for a long time. I didn't confront her immediately. That's not my way. I waited until Carol was at her book club on a Thursday evening, and I knocked on Stephanie's door. She was sitting on her bed with her laptop. She looked up, mildly annoyed, like I was interrupting something important. I said, "I need to talk to you about the account." She didn't flinch. She said, "Mom said it was fine." I said, "Carol didn't know about the Portland trips." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You track every little thing, don't you? Must be exhausting being you." I stood there. I said, "Stephanie, that was $1,200. She closed the laptop and looked at me with something that wasn't quite contempt, but was close enough to it that the difference didn't matter. She said, "You know what your problem is? You came into this family thinking you could buy your way into it. You can't. You were never really part of this. You're just the guy who pays the bills." Then she turned back to her laptop and opened it again. I stood in the doorway for another few seconds. Then I walked down the hall to the bedroom Carol and I shared. I sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at my hands. I thought about the first apartment I ever rented, when I was 26. I thought about my father. I thought about that promise I'd made. Then I thought, what exactly was I trying to prove, and to whom? I didn't tell Carol that night. Or the next night. I went through the following 2 weeks in the kind of quiet that people around me probably read as calm, but was actually something closer to a man taking stock of the situation he let go on far too long. I called my accountant. I called my attorney, not to start anything, just to ask a few questions. I asked about the joint account, about the house title, about what a separation would look like in Idaho. I wasn't planning anything dramatic. I just wanted to know what the landscape looked like. A man should know the landscape looked like. I also found a furnished apartment 3 miles from the house, month-to-month lease. 2 bedrooms, 2nd floor, view of the foothills. I paid the first month and the deposit on a Wednesday afternoon and drove back home in time to make dinner like nothing had happened. The night everything finally broke open was a Friday. Carol had taken the day off work. The 3 of us were home at the same time, which was unusual. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard Stephanie say something to Carol in the living room. I couldn't make out the words, and then Carol laughed, and something about the easiness of that laugh, the way they moved around each other like I wasn't even a variable in the equation, hit me differently than it ever had before. I poured my coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table. And I listened. At some point, Stephanie came into the kitchen to get something from the fridge. She glanced at me. I looked up and said very calmly, "Have you thought any more about what your next step is? Career-wise?" She turned around slowly. She said, "Why do you always do this?" I said. "Do what?" She said. "Act like you have any say in what I do with my life. You don't. You're here because my mother chose you. I didn't. And honestly," she paused. She looked right at me. "Honestly, the best thing that could happen for this family is if you just weren't in the picture." She said it the way you say something you've been thinking for a long time and are finally bored enough to say out loud. Then she took her yogurt from the fridge and walked back to the living room. Carol was in the doorway. I don't know how long she'd been standing there. She looked at me. I looked at her. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. Then she said, "She doesn't mean it like that." I nodded slowly. I said, "I know." I drank the rest of my coffee. I rinsed the mug. I dried my hands on the dish towel and hung it back on the handle of the stove. Then I went to the bedroom, pulled the duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet where I'd quietly packed it 4 days earlier, and walked to the front door. Carol followed me into the hall. She said my name. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to go stay somewhere for a while." She said, because of what she said, she's just... I turned to look at her. I said, "Carol." She said the best thing for this family would be if I wasn't in the picture. I'm going to let her find out what that looks like. Carol's face changed. I saw it happen. She wanted to argue, but something stopped her. Maybe she'd been waiting for this too. In some way she'd never let herself admit. I opened the door. I walked to my truck. I put the duffel in the back. I drove to the Marriott on Overland Road and checked in under my own name with my own card. I slept better that night than I had in 2 years. That surprised me. I'd expected guilt or grief or the particular loneliness of a hotel room at 63. Instead, I lay in the dark, listening to the quiet, and thought, I should have done this a long time ago. Not left, not given up, just stopped absorbing it. Stopped pretending the situation was sustainable in exchange for the comfort of not having the conversation. I ordered room service the next morning. Eggs and coffee and a newspaper, which I read cover to cover. I went for a walk along the Greenbelt. I called my oldest friend, a man I've known since we were both in the Navy, and talked to him for an hour. He didn't say much. He listened. At the end he said, "You sound like yourself again." I hadn't noticed I'd stopped sounding like myself. Carol called twice that first day. I let both go to voicemail. I texted her, "I'm fine. I need a few days. We'll talk soon." She texted back, "Please come home." I put the phone down. On the second day, she called again. I answered. She said Stephanie was upset. I said I understood. She said the house felt strange. I said I imagined it did. She asked when I was coming back. I said I wasn't sure yet. There was a long silence. Then she said, Are you thinking about something permanent?" I said, "I'm thinking about what's been permanent for 11 years, Carol. Stephanie has been disrespectful to me in our home for 11 years. You've seen it. I've never asked you to choose, but I need you to understand that I'm not walking back into that house until something actually changes. Not an apology, an actual change." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What does change look like?" I said. "Stephanie moves out. She gets a job in an apartment and she builds her own life. I'll help her do it. I'll give her 3 months of expenses to get started because that's who I am, and I'm not going to stop being that person. But she cannot live in our house anymore. Not after what she said. Not after 11 years of what she said." Carol said, "She's my daughter." I said, "I know, and I'm your husband. That's been easy to lose track of." 3 days later, Carol and Stephanie drove to the hotel. I had not invited them. The front desk called my room and said there were 2 women asking for me. I told them to send them up. When I opened the door, Carol looked tired in the way that people look when they've been crying off and on for days. Stephanie stood slightly behind her. She looked younger than 33. She looked for the first time since I'd known her, uncertain. I stepped back and let them in. We sat in the small seating area by the window. Me in the chair, Carol on the edge of the bed, Stephanie on the other chair, knees together, eyes on the floor. Stephanie spoke first, which surprised me. She said, "What I said was wrong." I waited. She said, "I've said a lot of things over the years that were wrong. I know that. I didn't think you'd actually leave." I said, "I know you didn't." She looked up at me then. There was something real in her face. I don't want to sentimentalize it, but it was there. I said, "Stephanie, I never wanted to replace your father. I never tried to. I just wanted to be a decent person in your life, and I wanted to be a husband to your mother. That's all I ever wanted. You've spent 11 years treating me like an inconvenience and a cash machine. I'm 63 years old. I don't have unlimited years left for things to be like that." She didn't say anything. She nodded slowly and looked back at the floor. Carol was crying quietly. She reached over and put her hand on mine. I didn't pull away. Before they came, I had placed an envelope on the small hotel desk. It had been there for 2 days. It wasn't divorce papers. That's what Stephanie probably thought when she saw it. It was a lease application for a one-bedroom apartment in a decent complex about 4 miles from our house. I'd already spoken to the property manager. The unit would be available in 3 weeks. First month, last month, and deposit. I'd already paid it. The envelope contained the keys, a printout of the lease terms, and the prepaid Visa card with $2,000 on it to cover furniture and whatever else she needed to get started. I slid the envelope across the desk toward her. I said, "This is what help actually looks like. Not a room in my house indefinitely. Not a card on my account. This. You start over. I'll support that. But it ends here." She picked up the envelope. She turned it over in her hands. She didn't cry. I respected that about her in that moment. She held it together. She said, "Okay." One word. It was enough. I didn't move back home that week. I stayed at the hotel for 10 more days. Not to punish anyone. I was past punishment. I stayed because I needed Carol to understand that my return was a choice, not an inevitability. That I was coming back because I wanted to, not because I had nowhere else to go. When I did go home, the house was quiet. Stephanie's door was open, and the room was mostly empty. She'd taken her things to the apartment over the weekend. Carol had helped her. Carol had made pot roast, which is the thing she makes when she wants to say something she doesn't have the exact words for. We sat at the table and ate. We talked about her sister's new grandbaby, about a trip we talked about years ago and never taken, about nothing important. At some point she put her fork down and said, "I should have done something sooner." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I didn't know how." I said, "I know." She said, "Are we okay?" I looked at her across the table. My wife of 9 years, who loved her daughter in a way that had cost both of them something, who had been caught for a long time in the middle of a situation she'd helped create and didn't know how to undo. I said, "We're working on it." She nodded. She picked up her fork. We finished dinner. I won't pretend that everything resolved cleanly after that. Stephanie got the apartment. She found a job within 6 weeks, administrative work at a medical practice in Meridian, decent hours, decent pay. She called Carol regularly. She called me once about a month after she moved out to ask a question about renter's insurance. It was a normal, practical phone call. She said thank you at the end of it. I said you're welcome. That was more than I'd expected. The thing I keep coming back to, when I think about all of it, is how long I told myself I was being patient, when what I was actually being was invisible. Patience is something you choose, consciously, because you understand why the wait is worth it. What I was doing was something different. I was making myself small and quiet and useful and hoping no one noticed how much it was costing me. A man can do that for a long time, but there's a bill that comes due eventually. Mine came due on a Friday morning in a kitchen in Boise, over a cup of coffee I'd made for myself, in a house I owned, when a 33-year-old woman told me I wasn't in the picture. The strange thing is, she wasn't entirely wrong. For a long time, I hadn't been. I'd been so busy being the guy who kept things running that I'd stopped being a person anyone had to actually reckon with. That changed. Not with anger. Not with an ultimatum delivered in a raised voice. Just with a duffel bag, packed quietly, on the top shelf of a closet, and a set of keys slid across a hotel desk. And the particular, hard-won silence of a man who finally understood the difference between being good and being used. I'm 63 years old. I've got time yet. But I'm done spending it, proving something to people who weren't watching anyway. I'd had a lot of time to think about how things like this happen. Not the dramatic moments, not what Stephanie said in that kitchen, not the drive to the Marriott, not the envelope on the desk. Those are just the visible parts. What I keep turning over is everything that came before them. The 1,000 small moments where I made a choice, and that choice, reasonable as it felt at the time, taught the people around me exactly what I was willing to accept. That's the part nobody talks about. We talk about the people who take advantage. We don't talk as much about how they learned it was safe to do so. I taught Stephanie, over 11 years, that I would absorb whatever she gave me and keep showing up the next morning with coffee made and bills paid. I wasn't passive exactly. I told myself I was being the bigger person, mature, stable, the kind of man who doesn't blow up a family over hurt feelings, But there's a difference between being steady and being invisible, and somewhere along the way I had crossed that line without noticing. What happened in that kitchen was the natural end of a long chain of cause and effect. She said what she said because she had no reason to believe there would be a consequence. I had removed all the consequences, one quiet compromise at a time, because I wanted to keep the peace. And the peace I kept cost me something I can't fully name. Some version of myself that knew his own worth without having to justify it. The morning I drove away, I wasn't angry. That surprised people when I told them later. Carol expected anger. Dave, my old friend from the Navy, expected it too. But what I felt was closer to clarity. The kind you only get when you finally stop arguing with reality and just look at it straight. What I did with that envelope, the apartment keys, the lease, the card, wasn't punishment. I want to be clear about that. It was the first genuinely useful thing I had done for Stephanie in years. Not useful to me, useful to her. Because the most damaging thing I had done, without meaning to, was make it too easy for her to stay exactly where she was. Comfortable, supported, and completely unchallenged. Nobody grows inside that. Nobody builds anything real inside that. Stephanie got a job within 6 weeks of moving out. 6 weeks, after years of starts and stops and half-finished programs. I don't think that's a coincidence. And Carol has been trying in the quiet way she has. She can't undo 11 years in a few months. Neither can I. But we're both looking at each other more honestly now than we have in a long time. That matters. I'm 63. I don't say that to invite pity or to suggest time is running out. I say it because, at 63, you have enough history to see patterns clearly. You can look back at a decade and trace exactly where things went sideways. That vision is a gift if you use it. The question is whether you use it to assign blame or to understand how to live differently going forward. I choose the second one. Not because I'm noble, because blame never got anyone worth going.